Kim Jong-un the first to arrive, and minutes later Donald Trump arriving in his motorcade. Both spent the night in nearby hotels, the St. Regis and the Shangri-La. Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un are making history, becoming the first sitting US and North Korean leaders to meet, shake hands, as they seek to end a tense, decades-old nuclear standoff. The two men strode towards each other and shared a handshake with the flags of both the countries in the backdrop before sitting down for initially a half hour of a one-on-one with just translators. Currently now the delegations are meeting, and then there will be a working lunch. Ahead of the meeting, the American president tweeted, "The fact that I am having a meeting is a major loss for the US, say the haters and losers. We have our hostages. Testing, research and all missile launches have stopped. And these pundits who have called me wrong from the beginning have nothing else that they can say. We will be fine." The two leaders struck an optimistic note before the meeting.
We're going to have a great discussion, and I think tremendous success. We'll be tremendously successful. And it's my honor, and we will have a terrific relationship, I have no doubt.
Well, it was not easy to get here.
우리한테는 우리 발목을 잡는 그 과거가 있고 또 그릇된 국민과 발행들이 우리 때로는 우리 눈과 귀를 가리고 있었는데 우리 모든 것을 이겨내고 이 자리까지 왔습니다.
The past worked as fetters on our wings, and the old prejudices and practices worked as obstacles on our way forward, but we overcame all of them and we are here today.
That's true.
What does that mean?
The one-on-one meeting between the two leaders lasted for around 35 minutes, following which they were joined by delegations from both countries for a second round of discussions. For more on those momentous developments, joining us live from Singapore is WION's Ramesh Ramchandran. We also joined from the US by American writer and former intelligence officer Glenn Carl, and Ambassador Arun Singh is with us in our studios here at WION. Ramesh, we've seen those pictures there. So far, so good.
Looks like it, Amitabh. We are coming to you from very close to the Capella Hotel, which is right there across the road from me. And this is the venue of the summit meeting, which began at 9 a.m. local time. It's been almost more than 90 minutes now since the two first met and had that much anticipated handshake inside the hotel, and thereafter they had a one-on-one, the first face-to-face meeting between a sitting American president and a North Korean leader at the hotel, along with their respective interpreters. And now they're having delegation level talks followed by a working lunch. So that'll bring curtains down on the unprecedented summit between the North Korean and American leaders. And just to give you a flavor of what is happening around me as I speak, there are a number of journalists from all over the world, from East Asia, from Europe, from Africa, everybody gathered on this small stretch of road leading up to the Capella Hotel, covering every minute detail of the summit meeting, analyzing the handshake, the body language, what might be the possible outcomes. And there's a tight security around here as well. You can see police personnel standing at every conceivable point along the road, maintaining security and discipline at this stretch of road leading up to the hotel. So as things stand now, the talks are very delicately poised. This has never been tried before, ever in American history. So I guess President Trump will be playing it by ear, taking one step at a time, in the hope that they can continue this dialogue going forward between their respective diplomats.
Ramesh, stay with us. Just getting in our guests now into this discussion. Ambassador Singh, we've seen the optics and heard the audio from both leaders there. And President Trump before said in his first minute he would be able to gauge where the North Korean leader was going. So far, it seems extremely good, both in terms of optics. There are people who are even counting the number of times they touched each other. It's 5-0, 5-1, something like that. But even in terms of what they've said so far, tremendous success, President Trump says. Kim Jong-un says past prejudices, obstacles will be overcome.
So, as you said, President Trump had said that within the first minute he'll know. And within the first minute, he has said that we will be tremendously successful. So, it's clear how the summit is going to be projected. And I think both the leaders are tremendously invested in the appearance of a successful summit. Because for North Korea, it's important. This is the first time he has ventured out. And this is the first time he's meeting a US president. He would like to move gradually towards a phase where the sanctions on North Korea are reduced. He can get more economic assistance. He can have a more normal trade and economic relationship with South Korea, with Japan, with China. And from President Trump's point of view, he has been wanting to show that he's a different US president. He can do something.
He's certainly shown that so far already in so many different locations all across the globe in so many different situations.
And he now needs to show successes.
Yeah.
Because so far, he has been a different and one can argue a destructive president. He's walked back from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. He's walked back from the nuclear deal with Iran. He has disrupted the G7 process where he agreed to a communique and then he disowned that.
Climate control.
And from the Paris climate change agreement. So this is an opportunity for him to show that he can be different and he can do something in terms of a new agreement, a new deal, something positive going forward. So for him also, the success of this summit or the appearance of success is very, very critical. So I think what we will have is a projection of a successful summit, more likely a projection of start of a process. Because at one stage, US had been demanding that the South Koreans must have immediate, complete denuclearization, verifiable, irreversible. But already they've been talking of starting a process. Yep. And so I think the real challenge will lie that once you have done this and the process starts, then how does each country negotiate its way through that process? Because each one will want to maximize its advantage. US would ideally want denuclearization of North Korea. North Korea is talking of denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Now, what does that mean in terms of presence of US troops in the Korean Peninsula, presence of US ships in that region? And if US is seen as walking back from its commitments in that region, what does it mean for South Korea? What does it mean for Japan? What does it mean for its other allies? And what does it mean for the US role in the global context at a time when the Chinese influence and power and global footprint is rising? So I think there are many things that are on play and at stake. And we have
that's what's making it so interesting, and the world is watching. Let me get in Glenn Carla, American writer and former intelligence officer, who is joining us from Boston. Thanks so much, Mr. Carl, for joining us. If you heard the ambassador there, how important is it for President Trump, who's been seen as a disruptive president in many ways, to come back with a success or at least project a success, especially in the run-up to November elections in the U.S.?
Well, Trump will always declare anything he does a dramatic, historic success. And success is central to his presentation of and conception of himself. So whatever comes of this is declared by Trump and his assistants as an historic success. The fact of the meeting itself is legitimately a dramatic break and event, and could itself be called a success. It's in particular a success for North Korea because, as the ambassador alluded to and others have said, this legitimizes North Korea and raises Kim Jong-un to the level of a peer with the president of the most powerful country in the world and with the president of China. I think we will almost certainly see a formal signing of the peace treaty between North and South, and probably other moves that are progressive. So it's a historic event, and even if nothing comes of it, and I think some things will come of it. Nonetheless, it will be declared by all parties a dramatic success. It might be less so in substance for China and Japan in particular, I'd say.
Right. As you're pointing out, that is the card that President Trump always plays, in fact, that he's winning. Ramesh, just coming back to you, tell us a little bit more about the delegations that are currently meeting. We do know that the National Security Advisor, John Bolton, who had raised a lot of hackles in Pyongyang, is part of the delegation. So is the Secretary of State and the White House Chief of Staff. And on the other side, the ex-spy chief, top foreign affairs officers, including the foreign minister from the North Korean side, Ramesh?
Indeed, Amitabh, as you correctly mentioned, Trump has in his delegation Chief of Staff John Kelly, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, National Security Advisor John Bolton, and other officials. On the North Korean side, the notable absentee, to my mind, has been Kim Jong-un's sister. Now, she's been a constant presence throughout the 27th April Inter-Korean Summit at Panmunjom in the demilitarized zone. She's accompanying him to Singapore as well. She attended some events alongside him in Singapore, but today she's conspicuous by her absence, and that to my mind is significant. At the same time, I'm struck by the fact that there are no surprises really this morning. They came, they met, they shook hands, they dispersed for talks. They're meeting as we speak. Unlike the 27th of April, when Kim Jong-un sprung a surprise on Moon Jae-in by pulling him across the military demarcation line into North Korean side and then walking back. So to that extent, there'll be no surprises. Everything going according to script here in Singapore. But what remains is the outcome from this summit. And I want to, at the risk of provoking Glenn Carl in the US, I want to ask him a very pointed question, Amitabh. The CIA's assessment, and Glenn Carl would know because he's not unfamiliar with CIA, the CIA assessment says the North Korean regime will not want to become the first country in the world to voluntarily give up its nuclear weapons. At best, the lowest hanging fruit could be North Korea allowing American fast food burger joints to set up shop in Pyongyang.
Glenn Carl, if I can bring you in there, there are also reports suggesting that maybe some missiles are given up apart from what North Korea has already done. What do you think of the CIA assessment that Ramesh was pointing out there, and how talks will proceed in terms of deliverables?
Well, certainly historically, for any nation, and I've said it many times with you folks, the inoculation against great power, meaning American invasion, is to be a nuclear power. And the explicit example cited that prove the point negatively are Iraq and Libya specifically, each country having been invaded after having irritated the United States substantially, neither of which had nuclear weapons. Iran clearly was seeking nuclear weapons to a large extent for that reason. And North Korea has also come to define its national identity, its pride, its sovereignty, and protecting its independence by having nuclear weapons. So I completely agree both with the agency's assessment, which is that North Korea will not really want to get rid of the weapons if it can, but its circumstances could now be so dramatic, tense, or problematic economically and socially that it sees more benefit to cutting a deal and drawing it out over a period of years. So I think I'll square the circle and say that both statements are true. And then the last thing I'll add is that the famous McDonald's index of the well-being of a nation by comparing the relative prices of McDonald's hamburgers from country to country possibly will start to be relevant in North Korea, but I'm not holding my breath too much for that. And one final thing, South Africa actually did renounce nuclear weapons unilaterally, thinking that the game was not worth the candle at that time. But I think that's the only specific case.
Sure. Ambassador, since we're talking about McDonald's, I wonder whether that'll be on the working lunch for Kim Jong-un. But on a more serious note here, Mike Pompeo yesterday did say that the US is willing to offer security assurances that are unique and that have not been offered before. What specifically could those be?
And we have to see what those assurances are and what do they mean. The US had offered security assurances to Libya, and circumstances changed. The president changed, because it was offered under one president and there was a new president. So I think, given the fact that the US has of late walked back from many agreements and deals that it had agreed to, security assurances are important, but I think no government is going to just rely on the security assurance of another country.
Can declaring peace, as in the end of war, be one form of a security assurance?
So I think a peace treaty would be very important, because if they are able to work out a peace treaty between North and South Korea, between North Korea, the US, I think that would be very, very important. It would be one kind of resolution.
But it's not enough.
It's not enough, because global circumstance can change.
Yeah.
And today the US is talking in terms of America first, and we don't want to play a leading role in the global context, and therefore there is a certain reluctance to intervene in other societies. But the next president could articulate things differently. So long as the US remains the dominant power globally, what decision it will take at any point of time is very difficult to predict. And I think no government, no regime, no country will rely just on the assurance of another country.
And they can't possibly, the security assurance can't be possibly that the regime or Kim Jong-un can continue on for decades. I mean, that's possibly not a security assurance.
And people can argue what is the authority of the US to give that assurance, because ultimately that has to be the authority of the people of Korea. And so at best the US can say that yes, a peace treaty, we will not interfere in the processes within North Korea. And already there are a lot of voices in the US and elsewhere raising the question that ultimately the US is doing an agreement which is very important on the nuclear issue, possibly, with a regime that is seen in the West as a brutal dictatorship. And therefore the questions are being asked. People are asking questions, will the US president be raising issues related to human rights?
Yeah.
Because in some other contexts, when they have pursued arms control agreements, they've also pursued human rights issues. And clearly in this context, because President Trump defines his politics differently, and because he wants a successful summit, he's unlikely to raise that. And so people would, and of course he will argue that what I've got is much better and it's not worth pursuing.
Donald Trump will always come out the winner. Ramesh, just coming back to you, I remember when you were answering the last question, you were talking about Kim Jong-un and her not being present at the delegation level talks. But there are a lot of reports that suggest she is present in Singapore, that there were 3 different flights that came in from Pyongyang, one of them bringing her apart from all the cargo and the portable toilet that goes along with Kim Jong-un wherever he travels.
Absolutely, Amitabh. She's been a constant companion throughout Kim Jong-un's engagements here in Singapore. She did travel on a separate aircraft, and she was seen with Kim Jong-un even last night when Kim Jong-un went for a night out here in Singapore, watching the various landmarks in this small city-state. But that said, she was, like I said, she was conspicuous by her absence here at the Capella this morning for the much-anticipated summit meeting between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un. But she is a constant companion throughout. She was present at all engagements yesterday and the day before when Kim Jong-un met with the Singaporean leadership. So she is a force to be reckoned with. She is part of the Kim family, so we can't possibly ignore her. And her opinion will count with Kim Jong-un, because remember, he chose to travel with her and not with his wife, as was the case, as earlier reported by the American side, that Melania Trump wanted to join Donald Trump here in Singapore. Both wives are conspicuous by the absence, but the fact that his sister is here, to my mind, is significant. We'll have to watch their relationship going forward as well, how this brother-sister duo sort of manage the affairs of the North Korean regime going forward. But as things stand now, Amitabh, the talks are happening, and one question I wanted to ask our guests was that in the run-up to the summit, we've seen Kim Jong-un take a number of measures. He released the American hostages. He announced a freeze on nuclear missile tests. He talked about rapprochement with South Korea. He reduced hostilities at the demilitarized zone. He took a number of steps. But what did he get in return? He only got more sanctions, more maximum pressure, and more insistence on complete, verifiable, and irreversible denuclearization. To my mind, and at the expense of again provoking an argument or a debate with Glenn Carr in the U.S., Trump may have been, as some are saying, may have been uncharitable and ungenerous with Kim Jong-un by insisting on CVID and wanting to have everything here and now, and not allowing time to allow make incremental progress going forward on these contentious issues.
Mr. Karl, others would argue, though, that Kim Jong-un has already emerged the winner just by shaking the hand of a sitting U.S. president.
Yes, well, I think, and have said since the drama began in January, that, or the rapprochement, let's say, that Kim Jong-un has been leading the dance, really, and has played his hand very, very well. He is now treated as a peer by China, by the United States, has met twice with the president of South Korea, and has strengthened diplomatically his negotiating position and his state, with the prospect of substantial change in the strategic equation for him, possibly at reduced cost, because developing nuclear weapons and intercontinental missiles is quite a drain on any country's economy. I also think that Donald Trump is so different, to use a neutral word, from American strategic thinkers and policymakers for the past 75 years, that although Secretary of State Pompeo has said the removal of American troops is not on the table or won't be discussed, or some expression to that effect, that since Trump is an isolationist and accepts de facto, although he hasn't said it explicitly, spheres of influence, that the makings of a deal, these guarantees, the only concrete step that immediately comes to mind would be materially, substantively important, would be some sort of removal of the American military presence, perhaps to Japan. I could well see Trump saying, the security is enhanced now, we're safer, there's no need for these troops, we aren't going to pay for them anymore anyway, and besides, it's only a 15-minute flight or something to that effect by our top jets. So I think that Kim Jong-un is playing a hand pretty well when the card he has is nuclear weapons threats. And other than that is dealing with a superpower, but one that seems to be tired and wanting to turn in.
Mr. Carl, again, when you're describing President Trump as different, now on the negotiating table, there are expertise on both sides in terms of experience on various levels. We've seen what the National Security Advisor, Mr. Bolton, has said, and his being present there is a statement in itself. But would there be a priority list, considering how different President Trump is in terms of what he wants to achieve? As Ambassador Singh was saying, would human rights not be brought up, or would it be lower on the so-called priority list, if at all?
Well, I'm sure that there are lists of American policy priorities and suggestions for negotiating positions and fallback and talking points. That's how things go. The ambassador, I'm sure, has spent his career in this sort of meeting. And normally, with any other leader of whom I am aware in my professional lifetime, a chief of state meeting is almost a kabuki theater, in a sense that the substantive work is done before anyone agrees to meet. They agree to ratify and to sanction, to have a ceremony. They don't get down into dealing with throw weights and launch schedules and troop presence numbers and so on, or arguing over commas. The stuff that the ambassador probably and I certainly spend a good part of our lives arguing about. In this instance, Trump refuses to read, we are told, and I believe it, any memorandum that requires more than a minute or two of his attention. I'm speaking seriously. And his briefings can only last a couple of minutes before he shuts them down. And he claims to be an expert in all subjects more than anybody, and doesn't need to have this sort of thing, so he says. So I think that all of the support is there. This is what the government is designed to provide and do. And Trump will listen to it somewhat and then go in with just his whim.
Right. Ambassador, bringing you in there, the fact that the National Security Advisor John Bolton is present after the summit almost got called off because of what he said and what the Vice President had said, is that a statement that President Trump is making to the North Korean side?
A lot of people had drawn attention to the fact that when the North Korean representative had gone to the U.S. for meetings in Washington, respectively,
he wasn't there.
At the Oval Office. Was not there.
Yeah.
But in this meeting, if the National Security Advisor were not present, I think it would be even more of a statement. And people would then question the role he's playing in the administration. Correct. Because after all, the National Security Advisor is a very key person in terms of putting the interagency process together. And if there is to be some kind of an agreement emerging from the summit, the implementation of that agreement would have to be coordinated by the National Security Advisor. So it would be also, if you look at the composition on the US side, you have the Chief of Staff, who is a former Army person, Secretary Pompeo, who is relatively new in terms of administration, a year at the CIA, and earlier a congressman for perhaps just one term, and therefore new to this issue. Whereas National Security Advisor Bolton, despite being a controversial person, has been involved in the disarmament-related processes for a long time and would bring certain amount of technical expertise to the table, again, as I said, despite his controversial past. So I don't think his being there is necessarily a statement. If he were not there, that would be a far bigger statement. But I think, again, North Korea has clearly taken a series of steps.
Yep.
They stopped the missile tests, they stopped the nuclear testing, they've taken steps to disable one of their testing site. So there has been a lot of signaling from their side. What they will certainly not agree to do is any kind of a firm commitment to what was described as a complete, irreversible, verifiable nuclear weapons destruction immediately. So they would want to agree to some kind of a process, and a process of denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula, leaving it a little ambiguous in terms of how they see the US role.
Sure.
And the test will really lie in how that process plays out. How does each side try to negotiate and work its way through that process to maximize its own role? And as the expert from the US pointed out, President Trump himself has raised a lot of questions about his commitment to US presence in the global context. We are encouraging, others will step up. So what kind of agreement emerges, I think a lot of people are unsure about.
Ramesh, just coming back to you, because I know it's hot and humid there in Singapore, even though we don't know what the temperature is like during those talks that are happening delegation level. You've spoken to people, experts, you've spoken to people from all sides. There are over 3,000 journalists there. You've spoken to the lookalikes of Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump. What really is the sense that you get of these two very colorful characters, if I can call them that?
Amitabh, it's been now almost 2 hours since they first met, Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un, for that handshake, followed by delegation-level talks. Now, as things stand now, the talks, I repeat, are very delicately poised because given their temperamental nature, the unpredictable nature, it could be either a complete success or a complete PR disaster. But that said, Trump has invested himself, his political capital, keeping his domestic constituents in mind back home, to ensure that this is an unmitigated success. Now, that said, I want us to spare a thought for one gentleman. He goes by the name of Moon Jae-in. Now, Moon Jae-in has invested a lot of time, energy, political capital, effort into preparing the roadmap for the peace on the Korean Peninsula. He came to power on the mandate of peace with North Korea, and he began by making that famous speech in Berlin in July last year, barely 1 year ago, when he drew that roadmap of peace, which was reciprocated in kind by Kim Jong-un in his New Year address. So he is the one who has done all the heavy lifting, and he is keenly watching the developments here in Sentosa at the Capella Hotel. The other country to watch out for is China. China is North Korea's biggest, probably the only benefactor. It has the economic leverages against North Korea, which it can employ going forward, which it has employed in the past. It might continue to do so going into the future. And China is keeping close watch on how North Korea or American attempts to co-opt North Korea into their regional architecture. Now, this talks has the potentially could reorder the Indo-Pacific architecture, which has implications for countries in the region and beyond. So, two countries to watch out for: South Korea, China. Remember, China lent the Air China aircraft to ferry Kim Jong-un from Pyongyang to Singapore. So that should tell you the close ties between China and North Korea, in particular Kim Jong-un and Xi Jinping, who could potentially be a leader for life for the foreseeable future in China.
Which is what Kim Jong-un is also attempting. Mr. Karl, can I get you to respond to that? China, we do know that Moon Jae-in is watching, or was watching at least live, whatever was telecast earlier at the Blue House in Seoul. China would also have been, reportedly was worried with North Korea getting closer to the US, a possible deal, then those two summits that were quickly held. A quick response, Mr. Karl?
Yes, yeah. Well, we've recently been reading about how China is concerned about the possibility of extending American influence across the 38th parallel into the north if there is a deal that comes of this. My sense, and I'm not a China expert at all, but my sense is that characterization might be a bit overstated. I think that the likely strategic victor long term to whatever agreement comes will actually be China. America's on the other side of the Pacific Ocean. The balance of power is shifting. An agreement will lower tensions and help China's strategic objectives in almost an innumerable number of ways. So I think long term, China is critically interested, but stands to benefit almost whatever happens, unless disaster were to come out of the agreement. If I could add one other thing, I think we do have some insights into how the U.S. Policy proceeds, even if experts like Bolton are not present at the meetings, and despite whatever Trump may say. Two examples, the recent tiff with Canada. Of course, Trump said outrageous things, deeply insulting to America's closest ally. However, in the 24 hours since then, the Secretary of Agriculture of the United States met with the Canadian counterpart and characterized the meeting as fruitful and productive. And the U.S. Trade Representative met with the Foreign Minister of External Affairs for Canada, and similarly characterized the meetings as friendly, productive, fruitful. When the U.S. bombed Syria, Trump declared that this was a dramatic act, but Secretary of Defense Mattis carefully designed the strike to cause minimal damage and not to threaten the survival of the Syrian regime, thereby not creating yet a greater crisis, despite what Trump said. So I think we can see what experts do in the wake of outrageous comments in the U.S. context recently.
Ambassador, you could take the issue of China first. Now, even though there were reports that Beijing was unhappy or jittery about what was happening on the peninsula, overall, as Mr. Carl is pointing out there, in the long term, the North Koreans would also be looking at a possible Chinese model, whether it's economic and political, how they've meshed the two in terms of, and 90% of trade is with China. So in the long run, China will be an important factor, whatever the outcome of this summit.
I think for North Korea to have success of its strategy, clearly they would want China behind them. They would not want to be 100% dependent just on China. Yeah. They would not want to be totally dominated, guided, controlled by China, but they would certainly want China behind them on the strategy. And I think it is important to watch how this plays out for China, because US has, over the past several years, been struggling to define its approach to the Indo-Pacific as they face the challenge from a rising China. Yeah. Even under President Obama, initially they had spoken of a pivot to Asia, signaling that they would put more resources, economic, political, military, in the Pacific to deal with China's rise, China's military rise, the area denial capacities that China was building up. Later they described it as a rebalance, and even that they were not able to do as much as they wanted, because they remain committed in Europe because of the challenge from Russia. They remain committed in West Asia because what was happening there. And President Trump has been signaling in an inconsistent manner in terms of how does he want to deal with China. Yeah. Does he see China as a challenge? Does he see China, does he want to cooperate? He has said that China has been very helpful in the context of North Korea. And yet in the National Security Strategy document in December and the National Defense Strategy document in January, China has been described as a revisionist power, challenging the United States. So we have to see how that plays out. And if the US, as part of any agreement with North Korea, is to reduce its footprint in that region, clearly it will be seen by many as the order in the Indo-Pacific shifting in some way. And so we have to watch the implications for that.
So are things shifting? Well, we do know that it's been almost an hour and a half now since the delegation levels talks have begun. Let's just listen in again to the brief comments that we could hear from both President Trump and Kim Jong-un. President Trump saying that it would be a tremendous success, and Kim Jong-un saying that old prejudices and practices that worked as obstacles have been overcome.
I feel really great. We're going to have a great discussion, and I think tremendous success. We'll be tremendously successful. And it's my honor, and we will have a terrific relationship, I have no doubt.
Well, it was not easy to get here.
우리한테는 우리 발목을 잡는 그 과거가 있고 또 그릇된 국민과 관행들이 우리 때로는 우리 눈과 귀를 가리고 있었는데 우리 모든 것을 이겨내고 이 자리까지 왔습니다.
The past worked as fetters on our wings, and the old prejudices and practices worked as obstacles on our way forward, but we overcame all of them, and we are here today.
That's true.
And since we were talking about China and the US's role, news is coming in that the US has unveiled a new $256 million representative office in Taiwan's capital, a de facto embassy that underscores Washington's strategic ties with the self-ruled island as it faces those escalating tensions with China. Ramesh, just coming back to you now, we've seen the photo ops, we've seen the optics, we've heard some of the comments that were caught by microphones there. There are delegation level talks now, working lunch. President Trump reportedly will have a press conference. We're not sure of Kim Jong-un, and then both leave in quick succession.
Indeed, that looks more like it, Amitabh. More likely that the American side, either President Trump himself or his Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, would be addressing the media, either a joint press statement or a separate press statement. But it's unlikely the North Koreans will address the media here. We're given to understand that Kim Jong-un is expected or scheduled to leave Singapore by about 2 p.m. local time, and Donald Trump leaves at about 8 p.m. in the evening. So there's not much time between now and the time Kim Jong-un leaves Singapore back to Pyongyang for the two sides to issue a joint statement. But a separate statement or a briefing can be expected from the American side. But that said, the key focus will be on the outcome, what might be the signaling they want to send out from this summit meeting here, and what the message they want to send out to countries in the region and beyond, that Donald Trump can be a deal maker too. Remember, as many commentators pointed out, he's been infamous for pulling out of the Paris Climate Change Accord, pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal. So he has brought it upon himself to ensure that this summit meeting taking place at the Capella should be an unmitigated success. Remember, this is prime time viewing back home in the US, so he's playing to his domestic constituents, and that would determine to a large extent the outcome of this summit meeting.
Ambassador, if I can bring you in here into, apart from the substance which you will see, either written statements or spoken by either side, both sides, is this the correct way to look at the protocol of what happens in terms of the events? So either both sides have single press conference, separate press conferences, which is the worst outcome, or they have a joint press conference, then there's a joint communique, and then the best possible outcome is a joint declaration which both leaders would sign. Is that the correct way of viewing it?
Yes. So I think if there is a joint statement or the joint declaration, and if it is signed by the two leaders, that is of course, or there could be just a joint statement, a joint declaration, because that then becomes a basis for both sides to work on. Yeah. But even there, even if you have a joint declaration, people can interpret the words there differently. So you can still run into a problem. And if you don't want, but it takes a lot of time to negotiate the joint statement. And if you don't want to go down that path, you can very often work out broad understandings in terms of what each side is going to say. And then each side gives their, but that can be a little trickier, because each side can interpret it differently, and therefore it can be prone to some accidents. So we have to see how they play out. And from what has been projected so far, the US would be doing a press conference. There is no talk of the North Korean side doing a press conference. But there has been so many unpredictable developments in this process that we should just wait and watch in terms of how it plays out. But another interesting dimension that came out in the discussions is that while President Trump in various scenarios has been projecting a certain line of action, at other parts of the administration, things are happening in a different direction. Even, for example, in the context of Russia. President Trump spoke about Russia being invited to join the G7 to make it again a G8. At the same time, the Director of National Intelligence was making a statement that Russia has been interfering in the processes in the US, action should be taken. And just yesterday, the US has sanctioned more Russian entities for what they call described as some kind of a cyber attack. So there is a very complex domestic process and assessment going on in the US in terms of strategies. And similarly with relation to North Korea, we'll have to see how does President Trump play for his own political interest and political inclinations. And then going forward, how does the rest of the US system respond to that and deal with it? So what it all suggests is that it's going to be a fairly complex process. Whatever be done today in simplistic terms to project it as a success.
It will be a process. Mr. Kal, just bringing you back to the point that Ambassador is again raising, which you had brought up yourself, say, in example to what happened in the G7 and President Trump. And there was a lot of pillaring of President Trump there, saying that the closest ally of the US, so to speak, Canada, was being called names while he was meeting a despot or a dictator here in Kim Jong-un. So are there two separate streams that are working in domestic policy in the US vis-a-vis international policy, of course?
Well, I think the ambassador is being polite and diplomatic in his characterization by saying it's a complex process, and you're being very rational by saying that there may be two streams. I think we're dealing with almost chaos in American policymaking. The president's statements, inclinations, and decisions he takes are almost invariably at odds with the positions of even the conservative Republicans, and certainly with the bureaucracies and agencies that exist to serve the executive and implement and recommend American policy. So there are real challenges for anybody, American policymakers and politicians included in particular, to make sense of what American policies are. That said, it is quite clear to many, and I am among them, that Donald Trump's positions are undermining just about every strategic position that the United States has taken in the creation of the post-World War II order for the past 75 years. It is shocking and historically consequential and harmful what is occurring.
South Korea, Japan, main players apart from the US and North Korea in what's panning out today. India, of course, not a major player, but is watching like the rest of the world keenly. Let's just listen in to Ramesh Ramchandran, who earlier spoke to the Indian High Commissioner in Singapore, Javed Ashraf, the envoy, of course, saying that he's hopeful of a positive outcome to today's summit. But more importantly, he said that India has expressed concerns over nuclear proliferation, especially the links between Pakistan and North Korea.
How does India view the much anticipated summit between the leaders of the US and North Korea happening here in Singapore on Tuesday morning?
There's much excitement in Singapore. As far as India is concerned, one, of course, the Prime Minister has always said that nations must have the courage to pursue dialogue over discord. And we therefore welcome the summit between President Trump and State Leader Kim. We have generally always stood for the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, for peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula, because in many ways it affects the entire region. It isn't just the question of relations between two Koreas, but there are a lot of major power interests involved there. Second, I think that you're all aware that we've been directly also in the past affected by what we certainly was a case of a proliferation relationship between DPRK and Pakistan, which is, in our view, well documented. And it just goes to show that what happens in one part of the world, and particularly in one part of Asia, seemingly distant from India, does have an impact on our security, on our stability, and on our and on the overall peaceful future for the region. So we hope that there is a positive outcome for this. It's going to be a long road ahead. These are very complex negotiations on an extremely complex and technical subject. There are a lot of things at stake. But it would also involve, I think, the interests of a number of countries in the region. And even though they may not be present here, their interests will have a bearing on the eventual outcome. So let's see where it goes from now.
Just before I get into those proliferation issues, just bring you up to speed with what Ivanka Trump has just tweeted. She's tweeted a picture or a group of pictures of the two leaders, Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un, meeting. Her pinned tweet, of course, which was 14 hours ago, said, "Those who say it cannot be done should not interrupt those doing it." It's in context, of course, to Melania Trump, the First Lady, not being there, and Kim Jong-un's sister, not being present at the delegation level talks. But that apart, Ambassador, proliferation issues with India has, and many other countries would also have vis-a-vis Pakistan.
So one concern we've had related to North Korea is their clandestine linkage with Pakistan in terms of their initially getting their nuclear weapons technology from Pakistan and in return sharing missile technology with Pakistan, which was of course a direct security threat to us. But there's another proliferation linkage which is of interest. In 2007, Israel had bombed a facility in Syria, which it said was having nuclear capability, which Syria had got from North Korea. And so people would want to get some clarity on that. And again, you would have noticed sometime back there was a report suggesting that the Syrian president was going to make a visit to North Korea. And so then a lot of questions were being raised around that. So there is certainly a lot of concern. And I think the wider concern would be that whatever agreement that is worked out between the US and North Korea to deal with the process of denuclearization, what is its impact on the global non-proliferation regime? And so that is something that people would be watching.
Global non-proliferation regime and its impact depending on what the outcome is. Ramesh, just coming back to you and India's concerns. India not a major player here, but we'll be looking keenly in anticipation of what exactly comes out in the fine print. You spoke to the High Commissioner there who had outlined the non-proliferation concerns. Ambassador Singh also talking about North Korean proliferation. In terms of a process, though, no one is really expecting something major to come out, though anything can happen, as we know today. This process, if you go back in past history to, say, the Iran deal, took almost 20 months after the deal was actually thrashed out with nuclear experts, with diplomats, and Iran had a much lesser nuclear program regime than North Korea.
Absolutely, Amitabh. I can't emphasize this point enough. India is among those handful of countries which have diplomatic missions in both Pyongyang and Seoul, and this fact should not be overlooked. It is significant. It is important for India to maintain a diplomatic presence in both North Korea and South Korea. And this point was articulated by none other than Sushma Swaraj, India's foreign minister, when she addressed a news conference sometime in August last year, along with the then U.S. Foreign Minister Rex Tillerson, that India will not shut down its embassy in Pyongyang just because the U.S. tells it to. It will continue to maintain the mission in Pyongyang, and that India sees North Korea relations from its own prism, not necessarily from that of the U.S. or its allies, number one. Number two is Prime Minister Modi's Act East policy. Now, it is a moot point whether India is getting its act together in the region, in the Indo-Pacific region or not, but everybody agrees that there is scope for improvement, that India must step up to the plate, take on additional responsibilities and become a net provider of security in the Indo-Pacific region and the Indian Ocean, extending from the Gulf of Aden in the west right up to the East Japan Sea in Northeast Asia. So clearly, neighbors are looking up to India in terms of political, economic, cultural and strategic ties. It's up to India to take advantage of that going forward. Whether we are able to do that or not remains a moot point, but India is making tentative steps towards that objective. Remember, Prime Minister Modi has traveled to every country of consequence in the Indo-Pacific region. Most recently he was in Indonesia and Singapore, where we have arrangements to set up, increase our strategic footprint on those islands. So clearly, India is making efforts. There's always scope for improvement. One other point Amitabh, that President Moon Jae-in will be traveling to Russia soon, and followed by that, he will be coming to India in July. That's the tentative date that we've been given to understand that. And that, to my mind, is significant because India-South Korea ties are equally important from India's perspective.
Glenn Carl, if I can just bring you in here, when we were talking about Iran and the nuclear deal with Iran and how President Trump exited that. Now, why would Kim Jong-un get into talks with the US when he sees what President Trump can do, and henceforth, possibly a next president can tear up this agreement as well?
I think that's a very good question. And those of us who have worked on our homes remember the saying that you measure twice and cut only once. And I think any negotiator, in particular North Korea in this context, would want to negotiate several times each point before signing anything one time. It's a point that the ambassador touched upon also, that the examples of the United States changing its position with regard to Libya and Iraq are existentially alarming facts if you are North Korea and an opponent of the United States. And it's not the United States per se, it's the interests, as the ambassador pointed out, change, policies change, circumstances change, and then guarantees no longer obtained sometimes. So North Korea should be, from its perspective, careful because it's an existential question. Absolutely. But the fact of negotiations imply to me that North Korea considers the circumstances dramatically dangerous for its continued stability.
Ramesh, you have a point to make here on this particular aspect?
Yeah, just a quick intervention there, Amitabh. Now, this so-called deal happening in Capella Hotel in Singapore is different from all the other agreements which America under Trump has pulled out of, be it the Paris climate change, be it the Iran nuclear deal, be it Trans-Pacific Partnership, all legacies of his predecessor Barack Obama. This has Donald Trump written all over it. He has no alibi, no excuse, no defense if he gets it wrong. So I suspect that he will try his best to tell his people, tell his critics, tell his detractors that this is how you make a deal. And I suspect he will ensure that going forward in one way or another.
Ramesh Ramchandran, we'll let you take a breather there in hot and humid Singapore as we wait for some kind of news on what's happening at that delegation level talks. And Glenn Carl, American writer and former intelligence officer, thank you so much for joining us from Boston. Ambassador, quick closing comments to this broadcast here on the issues that were raised by both Ramesh and Glenn Carl on why should North Korea have even approached these talks here when it's seen what has happened with Iran, when it's seen what's happened with Libya, when it's seen in some aspects what's happened with Saddam Hussein as well.
So I think North Korea has approached these talks because it wants to cut down on its isolation. It wants to get the economic processes going, wants to have a more normal trade and economic relationship with China, with South Korea, get some economic assistance from other countries. If they can get that process going, they will have achieved what they wanted. As part of that, as a bargain, they'll have to make some commitment on a process which talks about denuclearization. And so we have to see how that plays out. But we have to remember that in 1994 also, North Korea had entered into an agreement with the US where they had committed to full scope safeguards and they had committed to not effectuate their withdrawal from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And after some years, that agreement collapsed. So there will be a process now, and there is a North Korean interest right now to have a successful outcome. But how it plays out, how the circumstances around North Korea change, and how the policies in the US change after the congressional elections at the end of this year, presidential elections in 2020, will have an impact on the eventual outcome. So the story is still being told.
The story is still being told. Picture baki hai, as they say. Ambassador Singh, thank you so much. We'll of course we'll keep coming back to you as we get more news out of Singapore, as well as from Ramesh Ramchandran of WION, who's reporting from on the ground at the Capella Island.